There's a phrase that I've seen thrown around a lot in the Pokemon community, which is every Pokemon game is someone's first. But what many people don't consider is that every Pokemon game is also somebody's last. The idea for this video came from a trend I noticed in my friend groups and a surprising number of comments I've seen floating on the internet of long-running Pokemon fans stopping with mainline series after Sun and Moon. Though I also noticed a good number who also quit at X and Y. Before we go further, let me clear up what this video is and what this video isn't, and my history with Pokemon. If you want to skip that, check the timestamps on the video or in the description. For starters, this is not Palworld propaganda. I actually don't like Palworld, and I think it has some of the problems that modern Pokemon games have, plus quite a few of its own. But this also isn't a review of Palworld either, so I won't be going into detail. This video also is an anti-Pokemon propaganda. I had played Pokemon games since my early childhood, starting with Pokemon Blue, which I was loaned along with a Game Boy over the summer, and I also have very fond memories of playing Pokemon Sapphire as my very first game that I was allowed to play by myself without sharing with others. I don't regret playing the games I did, and I definitely am not here to tell you that your experiences are invalid or what you're supposed to like. This video might come off as very negative, but please keep in mind that it's only meant as a sort of criticism, and that for the most part it comes from a place of love. Finally, I want to clarify that this video is not a data-backed assertion that every single fan of older Pokemon games stopped playing at any one specific point. Not only is that obviously not true, but there's not really a plausible way for someone like me to prove it anyway. What this video actually is analyzing an interesting trend I found, discussing some reasons that people gave for why it is the way it is, and giving a bit of criticism of the Pokemon franchise as it is today. With that out of the way, let's get to some of the reasons people gave for why Sun and Moon, or X and Y, were their stopping point for Pokemon games. I'll give the reasons first, then go a bit in depth on them afterward, and finish out with my closing thoughts about the Pokemon franchise as a whole, which it might not be what you think. In essence, the reasons that I got for people stopping after the Sumo games were the following. Pokemon's story didn't seem to improve after Black and White and actually became more immature. The visuals and optimization were severely lacking when compared among peers on the same consoles. Newer Pokemon designs did not appeal or seem creative enough. There seemed to be a lack of innovation, leading to a sense that you are playing the same game over and over again, a la sports games such as FIFA and Call of Duty. The games offered less for you to do, both mid-game and post-game, with additional fees, things such as Pokemon Bank, Pokemon Home, DLC, etc., which were required to fully experience the games, leading to a lack of value. Finally, there have been a lot of apparent lies about production, which make players feel betrayed by the company itself. Now on to the breakdown. I'll start with the reason I didn't include originally, which I see some people from the outside giving, and the people from my survey did not. I don't think it really applies here, but what they said was they just outgrew the series. Now, I think to a certain degree it is true, but not in the same way that most people would mean when they say it. While there is no magic switch in us that changes what we like when we reach another year in our life, growing up does mean that we have more responsibilities and we need to be more discerning, and sometimes things we used to engage with no longer stimulate us enough to justify spending our time or money on. However, I think Pokemon games have the elements there to engage an audience besides the initial 10-year-old age group that's advertised, and indeed, we do see that many adults still play the Pokemon games today. We have seen that there are more mature stories and more mature aspects in the Pokemon series in the past, such as the original Team Rocket's abuse and the nuanced yet sinister Team Plasma in Black and White. However, games seem to be following a trend that all media is following nowadays, where they replace strong and imposing villains with toothless ones like Team Yell and Team Star. In fact, they aren't really even villains in the stories, and from what I gather, you don't even need to defeat Team Star to take on what is considered the final challenge of most games, the Elite Four. Sun and Moon did have a similar issue to a degree, perhaps you could say giving us a first look at what was to come. Team Skull performed some crude acts throughout the games, but for the most part are just everyday hooligans. The Aether Foundation itself isn't technically comprised of villains either, but they do perform some shady things that end up opening up the Ultra Wormholes to satisfy their greedy desires. Interestingly, both Guzma and Lusamine are some of the most complex antagonists in the series, with Guzma falling to despair when he couldn't get his way and turning to shady tactics to quote-unquote prove his strength, and Lusamine being a hyper-possessive person to the point where she essentially thinks of her children and her Pokemon as objects for her to own rather than individuals. Far cry from the simple mobster personality of Giovanni in Red and Blue, where he's sort of a generic money-grubbing guy, although to be fair, he does get a bit more story in later games. On to the point about visuals and optimization for Pokemon. I'll start by saying that I personally don't need a game to have super high quality visuals in order to enjoy it, and that goes for both the charming sprites of older games and for newer 3D models too. But it is easier to write off weaker visuals for a game if it, 1, is being sold for a price lower than the typical AAA game, or 2, is being made by a small company who's just getting their start. Red and Blue, or I suppose Red and Green, were the first try of the series and also didn't have a lot to build off of, so it's understandable that they had a lot of glitches and strange mechanics. When you have almost 30 years under your belt for making games and have made billions of dollars off of it, however, you'd think that there would be a greater level of polish to things. Of course, they are working in 3D now and on completely different hardware, but still. One reason we can cite for the way things are is the fact that the Pokemon Company is not just about releasing games, but they're also about merchandise. And when you have to roll out a whole new set of merch, you need to have a hard schedule for your games. Pokemon games used to come out roughly every 2 years, sometimes even longer between generations, like 4. But the recent trend has been a new generation every year, leading to very little time for development and optimization. We saw what lows the Pokemon Company was willing to stoop to with the launch of the Sinnoh remakes, known to some as BS Diaper, where the games had the same visual quality as a high schooler's fan game, and released physically without music or the ending in the game itself, requiring a day one update to properly experience. As well as the Scarlet Violet games, which were so riddled with bugs and game-breaking issues that, for the first time, Nintendo had to issue refunds on a Pokemon game. Even if it's a glitchy, constantly crashing mess with low-quality animations and missing music, they have to ship it out. Otherwise, the whole production line of products is halted. This to me is a good example of why I say that games often suffer for being products. The experience of the player is lessened for the sake of making money, whether intentional or not. The flip side to that, of course, is that most games wouldn't be made if they couldn't profit from it. And it's difficult to make a game of a greater scope like Pokemon without sacrificing a lot of time and money. Others in the monster collecting genre have better optimization and visuals though. One good example is Shin Megami Tensei 5, which is not only more mature and, in my opinion, has a good story, but the visuals far surpass Scarlet and Violet, despite being on the same console. Innovation. Sun and Moon were the first mainline games to break away from the typical Gym Leader challenge, changing up the formula and providing a unique experience to players. This was actually what enticed me the most about Sumo, and I enjoyed the totem challenges and kahuna battles a lot. Plus, they got rid of HMs, which was really a necessary thing. HMs made sense for the time, but rather than creating a more diverse team, what it meant was that 2 or 3 Pokemon on every person's team was just never used in combat. While maybe the battle gimmicks like Gigantamax and Terrestrialization could be considered innovation for the series, especially for competitive play, they don't really change up the main game experience. And most players don't actively engage in the competitive side of things. After Sumo, we basically went back to the same old formula and battle system that didn't really change in any significant fashion to old Pokemon games, which essentially meant we were repeating the same gameplay experience for 20 years in a row. That isn't to say that there hasn't been other innovations to the Pokemon formula. There was the addition of things like raids, Titan battles, and the Starmobile battles, but they didn't feel either different enough or interesting enough to entice Sumo players back. Essentially, Titan battles were a easier version of totem battles. At least Scarlet and Violet is open world, so it has that going for it. The less mainline games like Legends of Arceus and the Let's Go series also innovated on the franchise with a greater emphasis on the catching mechanic, but the battling mechanics as a result became tapered down, such as Legends not including abilities for Pokemon, and the Let's Go games removing the ability to battle during wild encounters. I suppose that leads into the discussion of a lack of content that people perceive in the newer games. I should preface this by saying that I, and likely many of the people who I interviewed, have not thoroughly scrutinized every single feature in the new games to find out if they truly have quote-unquote less features than previous games. However, I want to state that the perception of qualities for a product are just as important, if not more so, than the qualities the product actually has. If a consumer has to do an hour of research to find out whether something is actually full of features enough to justify their time to play with it, they typically aren't going to bother in the first place. And that's why advertising is so effective. This sense that there is a lack of content also comes down to the fact that many of the past features found in the Pokemon franchise have been stripped away. Removing features is almost always going to be met with disdain, even if the enjoyment that they got out of them was relatively minimal. So even if there is maybe a lot of things to do in Scarlet and Violet, older players are going to remember that we used to have Pokemon contests, the PokeStar Studios, the Underground, Hidden Bases, Battle Frontier, Pokethalon, the World Leaders Tournaments, the Dream World, the Game Corner, a whole second region, and many, many more mini-games. Not to mention that there are still plenty of older Pokemon which you can't obtain on the Switch yet. Considering how long this has been, I think I want to wrap things up by touching on a couple of final points and then give my overall conclusion. Pokemon games seemingly have become easier than ever to complete, and while they weren't actually difficult per se in the past, not only has the AI not improved, but EXP share and auto battles were introduced to quickly level all of your Pokemon, and that leads to the modern games not being any better in that department than the old ones. The EXP share is an especially divisive feature among players. Personally, I think its existence is fine, but do wish that, just like in Sun and Moon, players could turn it off whenever they wanted. Once it was stuck on by default, it was sort of the end for a lot of longtime players accepting the difficulty of Pokemon games. And Black 2, White 2, we have the ability to play on a challenge mode, which increased the number of Pokemon and trainers teams, improve their AI, and raise their levels, though unfortunately not their stats. While I also seem to recall that it wasn't that difficult on challenge mode, it's still a big step up from a normal playthrough. I don't think it's fair to use an excuse either that you can just play a Nuzlocke or a challenge to increase the difficulty, because self-imposed rules are something you can apply to almost any game. If these features were built in, that would be something else entirely. There is actually a ROM hack that I saw before called Crystal Clear that had a built-in difficulty setting, such as disabling XP when you reach level caps, imposing Nuzlocke rules in your playthrough, and much more. But back to the official Pokemon games. You might say that difficulty is decreased for optimizing Pokemon for competition as well, now that we have ability capsules and better breeding methods to create perfect Pokemon, plus powerful items that are more available. However, I actually find this particular aspect to be a plus, as hundreds of hours it would take to normally build a single perfect team, as well as requiring you to buy multiple versions of the same game or trade with people who for some reason want to give away such a powerful Pokemon, was a bit too much of a chore even for someone like me who enjoys a grind. Technically, however, Black and White did have the absolute easiest method for obtaining whatever Pokemon you wanted with whatever moves, even without the use of another game or cheating device, though it wasn't exactly on the up and up either. There was a website you could go to build a Pokemon, then set your IP to a specific value, and then essentially download the Pokemon into your game through an exploit in the trading system. I would still count that as cheating, of course, but interesting to note. The lack of difficulty certainly didn't come with an increase in balance either. Despite some people explaining away the cut to the Pokemon decks as a way to balance the games, there still seems to be a vast disparity in the power of Pokemon, perhaps even larger than ever. And come on, you can't tell me that being allowed to use Watchog on my team would ruin the balance. With all that said, here are my closing thoughts. There isn't anything wrong with games like the modern Pokemon games existing. Easy games, quick games, games with weak stories, and games designed with children in mind can and should be allowed to exist. However, after roughly 28 years, it becomes difficult to justify continually spending money on these types of games. Players have stopped buying the games as not some sort of protest, but because they don't see the value there for themselves. They know that Pokemon can be so much more than what it is, and they criticize it from a place of love. But sad reality of the situation is that the Pokemon Company is a company at the end of the day, and they will continue to make what earns them money first and foremost. If rushing out buggy games is still making them money, in record numbers even, that's a whole heck of a lot easier than putting in the effort of optimizing and perfecting their game. Despite the fact that Black and White was packed with so many features and a robust, mature story, it actually sold the worst out of every generation to date, as far as I could tell anyway. Now, I think people appreciate Black and White a lot more than they did in the past, and a lot of the criticism that they had was perhaps a bit misplaced, sort of a situation like Wind Waker. I also heard that the Black and White games were especially unique in the way that they could be pirated very easily, but still, dropping sales told the company that adding all these bells and whistles got them zero value in return. So why would they continue? Not only that, but the infamous "kids these days are more busy, so we didn't include features," or "we made the games easier because they'll just play cell phone games instead if we don't" quote unfortunately rings a bit true. Society has become increasingly overstimulated and less engaged with their media. They have so much that they could be doing instead of what they're doing right now. I felt this effect on myself even, having to go through tab after tab in my web browser while listening to a video in the background and needing to take my phone with me into the bathroom when I used to be completely content to just sit silently, put all my attention onto the radio or a single YouTube video, dedicating myself to it and really thinking, instead of having 10 things going on in my brain and not really processing any of them. Pokemon Sun and Moon, or even X and Y, was the last hurrah for many players because it was the last time they saw a chance to really experience a Pokemon game rather than just beat one. It promised a new type of experience, and it seems that it delivered. Everyone I asked said that they enjoyed Sumo despite the faults like the broken Z moves, a homogenized meta, and a completely linear adventure. For my part, I've been enjoying playing through the games a second time in a solo challenge with just a Lonely Grimer, which is currently a muck. We don't hate Pokemon, but we can't be blindly loyal to it either. And in this age of fake enthusiasm, shilling, and lack of respect for creativity, we should all remember not to be blind consumers. If you don't personally find something worth the price tag, don't buy it. If you think you'll actually get your money's worth, though, then go right ahead. At the end of the day, I can see why people would still like the modern Pokemon games, but the new ones just aren't for me, and they aren't for the others who stopped at Sun and Moon. Thank you guys for sitting through that long-winded discussion. I hope that it felt fair enough to both sides of the argument, and feel free to leave your thoughts and experiences with Pokemon in the comments. Thank you very much again, and have a great one.